ABC General Hospital spoilers reveal that the funeral of Marco was never meant to be a quiet farewell, but what unfolded around it began to feel less like mourning and more like the slow ignition of something far more dangerous. From the moment the first guests arrived, there was an unspoken awareness in the air, a tension that did not belong to grief alone. Eyes lingered too long, voices dropped too low, and every movement seemed weighed down by something heavier than loss. Marco's death had already fractured the fragile balance of Port Charles, but the gathering at his funeral threatened to shatter it completely. At the center of this shifting storm stood Jen Sidwell, a father consumed by grief yet guided by something colder beneath the surface. His pain was real, raw, and undeniable, but it had begun to evolve into something sharper, more deliberate. He was no longer just mourning his son, he was searching for a target, for a place to direct the unbearable weight of his loss. And in his mind, that target had already been chosen. Sonny had become more than a suspect. He had become the embodiment of everything Sidwell had lost, everything he could not control, everything he needed to destroy in order to reclaim a sense of power. Sonny's decision to attend the funeral was both instinctive and calculated, a move driven by conflicting impulses that refused to settle into a single intention. Part of him understood the risk, recognized the danger of stepping into a space where he would be unwelcome at best and openly despised at worst. But another part of him, the part shaped by years of navigating conflict and survival, refused to remain on the outside. If Sidwell believed he was responsible for Marco's death, then avoiding the confrontation would only reinforce that belief. Sonny needed to face him, not just to defend himself, but to prevent the situation from escalating into something irreversible. What Sonny did not anticipate was how quickly the funeral would transform from a place of mourning into a stage for accusation. Sidwell did not wait for privacy or restraint. He chose visibility, choosing the exact moment when the room was filled with witnesses, when grief had softened defenses and heightened emotions, to strike. His voice cut through the silence not as a cry of sorrow, but as a declaration. He accused Sonny openly, without hesitation, without doubt, framing him not just as a rival or an enemy, but as the man responsible for his son's brutal death. The words did not come out as speculation. They came out as conviction, sharpened by pain and fueled by the need to make that pain visible to everyone present. The effect was immediate and suffocating. Conversations stopped, faces turned. The weight of Sidwell's accusation settled over the room like a storm cloud that could not be ignored. Sonny for a brief moment found himself standing at the center of something he could not control, something that had already taken shape before he had the chance to respond. He was not prepared for the scale of it, for the calculated nature of the attack. He had expected anger, confrontation, perhaps even threats, but this was different. This was a public challenge, a deliberate attempt to rewrite the narrative in front of an audience that would carry that version of events far beyond the walls of the funeral. And the most unsettling part was that Sonny knew he was innocent, yet in that moment innocence felt almost irrelevant. Sidwell's grief gave his accusation a kind of authority that logic could not easily dismantle. A grieving father did not need proof to be believed. He needed emotion, and emotion was something he had in overwhelming abundance. Every word he spoke carried the weight of his loss, making it difficult for anyone present to separate truth from conviction, and that was exactly what made his strategy so effective. He was not just accusing Sonny, he was forcing everyone else to question him. This shift did not go unnoticed by Sonny. He felt it in the subtle changes around him, in the way people looked at him, in the hesitation that replaced certainty. For a man who had spent his life controlling narratives, this loss of control was more than frustrating. It was dangerous, because once doubt entered the equation, it spread quickly, infecting even those who should have known better. But Sonny was not the only one affected by what was unfolding. Kristina, watching from the edges of the gathering, felt something deeper than shock. She felt fear, sharp and immediate, cutting through her attempts to remain composed. She had always understood that her father lived in a world defined by risk, by conflict, by choices that carried consequences, but this felt different. This was not a hidden threat or a quiet maneuver. This was open, aggressive, and unpredictable. The kind of situation that could spiral out of control without warning. Her fear was not just for Sonny's reputation or his position, it was for his safety. Because if Sidwell was willing to confront him so publicly, to escalate the situation in front of so many witnesses, then there was no telling what he might be willing to do next. And Kristina knew, perhaps better than anyone, that once emotions reached this level, reason often ceased to matter. The implications of Sidwell's actions extended far beyond the funeral itself. By choosing to accuse Sonny in such a visible way, he had shifted the conflict into a new phase, one where confrontation would no longer be contained or controlled. It was no longer about suspicion or quiet investigation. It was about perception, about influence, about who could shape the story that everyone else would believe. And beneath that shift, something even more unsettling began to take form. There was a sense that Sidwell was not acting alone, that his confidence, his willingness to escalate so dramatically, was supported by something unseen. His accusation felt too precise, too intentional, as if it had been prepared in advance, as if this moment had been anticipated and carefully constructed. It raised questions that no one could yet answer. Questions about who had given him this certainty, who had guided him toward this confrontation, who might be benefiting from the chaos that was now unfolding. Sonny felt it too, that subtle awareness that something larger was at play. This was not just about Sidwell's grief. It was about manipulation, about strategy, about a plan that extended beyond a single accusation. And as that realization settled in, it became clear that the funeral was not the beginning of the conflict. It was the moment it became impossible to ignore. What had once been tension beneath the surface was now exposed, raw and volatile. Alliances would be tested, loyalties questioned, and every decision moving forward would carry weight that could not be undone. Sonny stood at the center of it, not just as a target, but as a catalyst, a figure whose next move could either stabilize the situation or push it further into chaos. Kristina, watching him, understood that more than anyone. Her fear was not just a reaction to what had happened. It was a recognition of what was coming. Because once a line had been crossed this openly, there was no easy way back. The conflict had been made public, the accusations spoken aloud, and the consequences were already beginning to take shape. The funeral of Marco was meant to mark an ending, but instead, it became the beginning of something far more dangerous. And as the echoes of Sidwell's words lingered in the air, one truth became impossible to deny. This was no longer a private war. It was a battle that would unfold in full view of Port Charles, where every move would be watched, every choice scrutinized, and every mistake magnified. And in that kind of environment, even the strongest could fall. The funeral of Marco had already begun to feel like something far more dangerous than a moment of mourning, but no one could have imagined how deeply it would descend into darkness. Grief hung in the air, thick and suffocating, yet beneath it there was another current, something sharper, more volatile, waiting for the right moment to surface. That moment came not with a whisper, but with a rupture so violent that it redefined everything that followed. Kristina had never intended to stand at the center of that storm, yet in many ways she had always been moving toward it. Her presence at the funeral was not just about paying respect or supporting her father. It was about confronting a reality she could no longer ignore. She had lived too long in the shadow of consequences, too long watching the ripple effects of choices made by others, by Sonny, by his enemies, by the world that seemed to orbit around power and retaliation. And now, standing in that fragile space between grief and confrontation, she became the one who would bear the cost. Sidwell's grief had already twisted into something unrecognizable, something that no longer resembled sorrow but resembled purpose. He had lost his son, but instead of collapsing under that loss, he had sharpened it, turned it into a weapon that needed to be used. When he looked at Sonny, he did not see a man. He saw a cause, a reason, a justification for everything he was about to do, and in that moment, Kristina became something else entirely in his eyes. She became a symbol, a reflection of Sonny's life, Sonny's choices, Sonny's perceived sins. The shift happened quickly, almost too quickly for anyone to fully comprehend. 1 second, the room was tense but contained, voices low, emotions restrained. The next, something broke. Sidwell's control, whatever remained of it, gave way to a decision that had already been forming beneath the surface. It was not impulsive, it was not accidental. It was the culmination of everything he had been building toward, a calculated act disguised as an explosion of grief. Lucas saw it before most others did. There are moments when time seems to fracture, when reality slows just enough for certain details to become painfully clear. Lucas, already on edge from everything that had unfolded, recognized the shift in Sidwell's posture, in the way his focus narrowed, in the way his grief hardened into something decisive. It was not just anger, it was intent. And by the time Lucas understood what that intent meant, it was already too late to stop it. Kristina never had the chance to react. What followed was not chaos in the usual sense. It was something quieter, more devastating. A single act that cut through the tension like a blade, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than any scream. For a brief suspended moment, the world seemed to hold its breath, as if refusing to accept what had just happened, and then reality rushed back in, overwhelming, undeniable, irreversible. Kristina's life ended not in isolation, but in the center of everything, in a place where grief had already taken root, now transformed into something far more haunting. Her death did not just add to the tragedy of Marco's funeral, it redefined it. What had been a farewell became a turning point, a moment that would echo through every life connected to it. Lucas stood frozen, caught between disbelief and a surge of emotion he could not yet process. He had witnessed it, not heard about it, not pieced it together after the fact, but seen it unfold in front of him. And that kind of knowledge does not remain neutral. It does not sit quietly in the mind. It demands something. It demands reaction, response, consequence. What Lucas felt in that moment was not just shock. It was the beginning of something darker, something more consuming. Hatred did not arrive all at once, but it began to form, slow and deliberate, rooted in the image he could not erase, the understanding he could not ignore. Sidwell was no longer just a grieving father or a dangerous figure operating in the background. He had crossed a line that could not be undone, and Lucas, whether he wanted to or not, had become part of the aftermath. For Sonny, the impact was even more devastating. Loss was not new to him. He had lived through it, survived it, carried it with him in ways that shaped who he was. But this was different. This was not the distant consequence of a dangerous life. This was immediate, personal, and brutally direct. Kristina was not supposed to be part of this. She was not supposed to pay the price for a conflict that had been building between men who chose to live in that world. And yet, in a single moment, she became the cost. Sonny's grief did not come as an outburst. It came as a collapse inward, a fracture that spread silently before it ever became visible. Because beneath the sorrow, beneath the disbelief, there was something else. Responsibility. Whether justified or not, whether logical or not, it was there. The awareness that his life, his choices, his enemies had created the conditions for this to happen, and that awareness is something that cannot be easily dismissed. The consequences of Kristina's death extended beyond individual grief. It altered the trajectory of everything. Sidwell had not just struck at Sonny. He had changed the nature of the conflict entirely. There was no longer any illusion of boundaries, no sense that certain lines would not be crossed. That illusion had been shattered in the most irreversible way possible. Lucas, carrying the weight of what he had witnessed, now stood at a crossroads he had never intended to reach. Knowledge, in this case, was not power. It was burden. It meant he could not step away, could not pretend ignorance, could not remain unaffected. What he had seen would shape his actions, his choices, his perception of everything that followed. And as that realization settled in, so did the understanding that he would not be able to forgive, not easily, perhaps not ever. The funeral of Marco, meant to mark an ending, had instead become the beginning of something far more destructive. 2 lives lost, not in isolation but in connection, each death feeding into the next, creating a cycle that showed no sign of stopping. And as Port Charles struggled to absorb what had happened, one truth became impossible to escape. This was no longer a story about grief. It was a story about escalation, about the moment when pain transforms into something that cannot be contained, something that spreads, that consumes, that demands more in return. And in that kind of story, there are no easy endings, no clean resolutions, only consequences that continue to unfold.